Into our discussion of the Age of Enlightenment, we were talking last time about these philosophical concepts that are developed during the Enlightenment by Enlightenment thinkers. And the reason that we're talking about these five is because they have particular importance for the development of American political ideals and American political institutions. Okay? So even though we're 300 years removed from the Enlightenment, or approximately 300 years removed from the Enlightenment, right? It's the 18th century. Late 1600s to the early 1800s, so primarily the 1700s. 300 years later, there are still impacts that we see from the thinking of the Enlightenment. And, you know, if you remember, I told you that the three most important documents of American political life, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Constitution written in 1787, and the Bill of Rights written in 1789, are clearly products of the Enlightenment, not only in that they were written during this period, but that they very clearly reflect the Enlightenment principles, the Enlightenment concepts that we're talking about. Okay? So what we're trying to do then in talking about the Age of Enlightenment is come to some understanding of how the framers of our Constitution, how the founders of our political system viewed human beings, their role in the world, why human beings live in social arrangements, and why we have government, and how much authority, where government gets its authority from, and how much authority government has. Those are really the kinds of questions that we're trying to address as prelude to our discussion of the Constitution. Okay? So I don't remember exactly how far we got with this last time. I have a pretty vivid memory of us talking about the atomistic concept of society. Let's do it this way. Let me open the floor to any questions that you might have. This is really, once we get through the atomistic concept of society, the rest of them go pretty quickly. So we're investing a little bit of time talking about this one because I want to make sure that everybody's clear on this point. Do you have any questions or concerns about what this means? Yes?
So the list here, this is all the legacies of enlightenment, right?
These are philosophical ideas or concepts that were developed by Enlightenment thinkers. But they still inform the way we view the world today, the way Americans view society, the way that we view individuals in society, and the way that we view government today. So even though the Enlightenment is over, the Enlightenment principles or the Enlightenment way of looking at these things still very much impacts the operation of our system today. Does that make sense? Okay. We were talking about last time about how each of these, represents a challenge to the pre-Enlightenment concept. So what did we say the atomistic concept of society represents a challenge to? What's the pre-Enlightenment concept of society? The organic, or if you prefer the term holistic. Okay? So that raises the obvious question, well, what is the organic concept of society? And remember, we looked at the passages from Aristotle's Politics as an illustration of that. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, going back almost 2,500 years, writes that political society is a product of nature, right? It is an organic entity. It is a living, breathing thing. Just like a person is a living, breathing thing, or a horse is a living, breathing thing, or a butterfly is a living, breathing thing. Political society is a living, breathing thing. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's preposterous. How can anybody believe that political society is a living, breathing thing? Just pause for a moment. Try to have a less parochial view of things. Try to have a broader understanding, and at least appreciate that organic concept of society has a much longer history, a much more entrenched history in Western thinking than the atomistic concept of society. The organic concept of society dominated Western thinking for over 2,000 years at least. Okay, that long. And it's not until the 1700s, or late 1600s, that Enlightenment thinkers come along and say, no, that's not right. It's not a product of nature. It is an artificial or a mechanical construct. Okay? That's the new kid on the block, so to speak. Right? And if you've ever wondered why, and we've sort of touched on this in passing at least once in this class, if you've ever wondered why, for example, Europeans have been more receptive to competing ideologies in more recent history, like, say, socialism or communism, whereas Americans have just sort of rejected those out of hand, right? Americans in the 20th century, for example, Americans did not give any serious consideration to communism as an alternative. I mean, we viewed it as a threat. I mean, we gave serious consideration to communism because we saw it as a threat, right? Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, said, "We will bury you," right? And they had nuclear weapons pointed at us.
Thank you.
Right? So, I mean, they had nuclear weapons pointed at us, so we had to take it seriously. So when I say that we never took it seriously, what I mean is that we never entertained it as a credible alternative, as something that we might accept. We just rejected it, right? And why is that? Again, we touched on that. Why is that? Well, because, think about the natural extension of these concepts, right? What's the natural extension of an organic concept of society? Well, it's this emphasis on collectivism, collective arrangements. Do you recall when we read the passages from Aristotle, he writes that all individuals are only parts of a whole, all equally depending on the whole for their existence and all that sort of stuff? Right? That's a very unpalatable, unsavory notion for Americans. We much more prefer individual emphasis, like an emphasis on individuals. That's my life is what's important, not the life of the political community. That doesn't mean that some people don't engage in politics and participate in the political life of the community. It just means that I don't think there are very many people that they'll put it as sort of their purpose of existence. But that's exactly what Aristotle says, if you recall, right? That, this concept of the telos, that the highest form of development, earthly existence for a human being is to be a member of a political community, participating in the life of that organic whole. Okay? So, questions about any of that? Look, one of the reasons that it's so important for us to understand this, you'll recall that we said last time that the atomistic concept of society gives rise to social contract theory. Locke, in the Second Treatise of Civil Government, develops the theory of the social contract. And certainly the Americans in the revolutionary period latch on to these notions. And they're really the intellectual motivation of the American Revolution. So, for example, when we look at, I'm going to jump ahead here just a little bit, because today we're going to talk in some detail about the Declaration of Independence. But let me just to sort of drive this point home, let's take a quick look at a passage here from the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson writes in the second paragraph, as soon as this there it goes. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Jefferson, in the highlighted portion that I have there, that blue highlighted bar, in one short sentence, and actually it's really not even a complete English language sentence, it's a couple of dependent clauses strung together with some punctuation, where your English professor would quickly mark that and say, comma splice. Right? At any rate, Jefferson tells us in these two very concise phrases what took Locke an entire volume in the 1680s to develop in the Second Treatise of Civil Government. He boils it down basically to these two propositions. Why do we have government? What does he tell us? Why do we have government? It's highlighted for you. It's not a trick question. Why do human beings create political society and establish government? To secure these rights. Which rights are those? The rights of individuals. That's not an organic concept of society. That's an atomistic concept of society. He's saying that human beings are very deliberate about what they're doing in this regard. They establish a political society and government for the purposes of securing the rights of individuals. Everybody with me on that? And then the second part of the social contract theory concerns where government gets its authority from. See, the significant contribution of Locke in the 1680s, and if I mentioned this to you last time and I'm repeating myself now, I apologize for repeating myself, but maybe it's a point that bears repeating, that is worthy of repeating. If I didn't say this last time, it's news to you. Pay attention to it, okay? When Locke wrote the 1680s, when Locke was writing in the 1680s, wrote the Second Treatise of Civil Government, he was writing in defense of restoring the monarchy, okay? The British had a brief period where they experimented with republican government. They had chopped off the head of Charles I and Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector Cromwell, and the so-called Roundheads came to power in Britain. They ruled for about 30 years or so, but the British tired of Cromwell and his antics, the Puritan oligarchy as it was called, and they restored the monarchy. So when Locke is writing the Second Treatise of Civil Government in the 1680s, he's writing in defense of restoring the monarchy. So he's not a Republican, okay? But what Locke says about the king's authority is what is really critical, particularly for the Americans 80 years later, 90 years later, during the Revolution. What had the kings of Europe believed about their power before Locke came along to correct them? Where did they get their power from, they believed?
The blood.
Okay, it's hereditary, yes, but where does the power of the king, where does the authority of the king come from? You all ever heard of the divine right theory? Does that ring a bell for anyone? From your history course? No? Anyone?
I mean, it does, but not into depth that I can really.
What does it sound like it means? Divine right theory. There are some connections across courses that you take in your curriculum as an undergraduate, right? So, for example, when you're taking your history class and you're learning about the Age of Enlightenment, it doesn't surprise you when you come into your American government course and Fagin's droning on and on about the Age of Enlightenment. Or when they talk about divine right theory in your history class, you come in and Fagin mentions that you have some context for that. The divine right theory was the belief that the king got his authority from God. Okay? Now, if I'm king and I get my authority from God, who are you to challenge my authority? If you challenge my authority, you challenge God. That must be what it means, right? What a perfect defense of absolute rule. How convenient for Louis XVI in France to believe that he gets his authority from God. He can do whatever he wants. Locke comes along in the 1680s and writes in the Second Treatise of Civil Government, the king doesn't get his authority from God. Where does the king get his authority from, do you think? Well, again, Jefferson, summarizing Locke, says very clearly, very concisely, that governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Not deriving their powers from God, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. You're right, the people. And that's the contribution that Locke makes, and that is the point that the Americans seize upon. Because by the time you get to the Revolutionary period, okay. By the way, let's quick history lesson here. Maybe a refresher course. A quick 5-minute refresher course for you. When was the first English colony in America?
17.
Nope, earlier than that.
15.
What was the first English colony in America? How about that? Jamestown, right?
Jamestown.
When was Jamestown founded?
1607?
Good, yeah, I think around 1606. That sounds right to me. And then, of course, you had the Plymouth colony, Massachusetts Bay colony around the 1620s, and then others throughout the, of course, the first half of the 1600s through the rest of that century. Okay? So we mark the beginning of the American colonial experience at 1606. Okay? Early 1600s. Okay? When did the trouble between the colonists and Britain begin? Give me a year.
Those taxes.
We know 1776 was independence, but the trouble, they didn't just go from happy relationship with Britain to independence, right? There must be some series of events that led up to the Independence Declaration, right? I'll give you the year. Maybe this will give you some reason to remember. I'm going to mark this at about 1763. Anybody know what happens around 1763? I think that's right. Again, I'm not a historian, but I think I got that right.
The Boston Massacre?
No, that was before.
No, never.
No.
Just kidding.
Was the no.
This is really the what we're looking to here is the end of what they called in America the French and Indian War, what they called in Europe the 7 Years' War. Okay? But that marked a change. What we're saying here is that that was a point of demarcation. Before 1763, the Americans for 150 years pretty much did their own thing, okay, without really any interference whatsoever from Britain. They governed their own affairs. They tended to their own commerce, right? But as a result of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, whichever you prefer, okay, Britain suddenly began to take a much keener interest in colonial affairs, and particularly regulating their commerce. Remember, Parliament begins enacting all this onerous legislation that the Americans considered to be onerous legislation. The Stamp Act, the Sugar Tax, the Declaratory Acts, the Navigation Acts, the Intolerable Acts. Remember all that from your history lesson? What all of that really had in common was that the British were sticking there, from the American perspective, they were sticking their nose into American affairs where they hadn't stuck their nose in before. They were regulating their commerce. That was the big deal. They were, imposing these what the Americans considered to be overtaxing regulations. So anyway, if we look at the language here of the Declaration of Independence, to get back on track, notice the next clause here. Let's bump ahead. I'll highlight that part of it. Jefferson continues that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Can you appreciate the artificial, mechanical notion that Jefferson is suggesting here? That if government is not serving the purposes for which it was established by contract, and that was their view, that the king had broken the contract. And you know how contracts work, right? If one party to the contract doesn't live up to their obligations under the contract, then the other party to the contract doesn't believe that they have to live up to their obligations under the contract. And that's the way the Americans viewed things. We have this contract with the king, George III. He's broken the contract. Therefore, we are no longer bound by the contracts to be loyal subjects of the crown. In fact, we're declaring our independence and establishing our own path. Right? But notice here the artificial or mechanical concept underlying what Jefferson's writing. If government is not serving the purposes for which it was erected, to secure the rights and liberties of individuals, then the people have a right to change it. It's not an organic thing, right? It's a mechanical thing. You can abolish it, completely abolish it and start over. You can rearrange it, you can reconstitute it, you can reform it. That's why the atomistic concept of society is so critical. The Americans don't get to hear The Americans don't get to this point right here, okay, of declaring their independence and rejecting the contract that they believed that they had, saying it was dissolved, if Locke doesn't first come along and the other Enlightenment philosophers don't first come along in 80 years earlier, 90 years earlier, and challenge the organic concept of society. Does that make any sense at all? Does it make no sense whatsoever?
No.
Everybody good with that? Anybody not good with that? Anybody have questions?
Can you go back to the other page?
Yeah, eventually, we'll get back to it. And I want to make sure that everybody has sort of this broad point, because we're still really just trying to wrap up from what we said in the previous class meeting before we move forward. Okay. I'm going to take that to mean that you're all good to go with the atomistic concept of society. All right. Let's move on. Individualism as the avenue of universal human progress. Did we get to that last time? Did we talk about that?
No, sir.
I think you can probably appreciate that if the Enlightenment thinkers begin with this atomistic concept, it's going to give rise to an emphasis on individualism. The freedom of the individual, the rights of the individual, and that human society improves, human society moves forward, human society progresses when individuals are allowed to be free. I think we've made this point previously, maybe in a little bit different context, right? Remember, the Enlightenment thinkers have this idea that human beings are rational, okay? They're firmly convicted of that human beings are rational. One of the things that means, we didn't really have a chance to develop all the implications of rational behavior. One of the things that it means, though, is that each individual is the best judge of his or her own interests. Okay? That you are the best judge of your own interests. That nobody knows better what's good for you than you. Particularly not government. So that if individuals are allowed to be free and to identify for themselves what is in their interests and to pursue those interests, I think that's what Jefferson means by the pursuit of happiness. If you're allowed to pursue those within reasonable, restrictions. I mean, you can't just do anything you want. That's not what they're saying, because that might impede someone else's liberty or somebody else's rights. But within reason, if individuals are free to pursue their own rational self-interest, then they are most likely to be successful. And so that the social good, common good, however you want to say this, human progress is really the sum total of all the individual progress. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear how, these are complementary. These first two are complementary notions. Whereas we said, I won't take it back down, but as the organic concept of society, what's the logical extension of the organic concept of society? An emphasis on collective arrangements, collectivism, right? Okay, let's move on. Did we talk about deism at all last time?
No.
Okay. Deism, as the dominant theological orientation of the Enlightenment, represents a direct challenge to the universal teachings of the Christian church up to that period, the Catholicism of the pre-Enlightenment period. Notice that's a lowercase c, Catholicism, not an uppercase c. I don't mean the Roman Catholic Church necessarily, but just Catholic in the Greek sense of the word Catholic, meaning universal. Universal Christian teachings, universal Christian doctrines. Okay? Okay, so deism represents a challenge to Catholicism. That's an important point, by the way. I don't want you to, it's not just sort of an aside that I just made. I'm not talking narrowly about the Roman Catholic Church. I'm talking about the Christian doctrine generally. Deism represents... deism, for example, look, the point I'm making is this. We know from our history lessons that the Protestant Reformation was a challenge to the Roman Catholic Church. All right? What I'm saying here more generally is that deism as a theological orientation was a challenge to the more general, the more universal Christian doctrines. Yes?
What does, like, as a word, deism means?
Yeah, what was the definition of the word deism? Good question. I was just about to show you a dictionary definition of that. Okay? So let's have a look at that. I think this is actually taken from Webster's. Okay? Deism is a movement or a system of thought advocating natural religion. And I added natural law, laws of nature, laws of the universe, laws of the cosmos, etc. in the parentheses. So a movement or system of thought advocating natural religion based on human reason. Notice that. Based on human reason.
Can we read that?
Rather than divine revelation, emphasizing morality, and in the 18th century, the very period that we're talking about, denying the interference of God with the laws of nature. Deism is a movement or system of thought advocating natural religion based on human reason rather than divine revelation, emphasizing morality. And in the 18th century, at the height of the Age of Enlightenment, denying the interference of God with the laws of nature. The American founders. Most of the names that you're familiar with, you remember from your history of the American Revolutionary period. Certainly people like Jefferson and Franklin, and many of the other names that you would recognize of the American Revolution were deists. Jefferson in particular. And that's why, for example, don't worry, I'm going to come back to it. I can see that you all are busy scribbling things down. But that's why Jefferson could very comfortably use phrases in the Declaration of Independence like, look at that first paragraph there. Jefferson writes, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Isn't that interesting phraseology? Why in the world would he use the phrase laws of nature and nature's God? How interesting. Well, because for Jefferson and the other intellectuals of this period who were deists, what was really important here was the idea of these immutable laws of nature. Remember, this isn't just the age of Locke, as I've told you previously, and Voltaire and Montesquieu, the political philosophers. It's also the age of Newton, right? And the development of the laws of motion, and the law of gravity, right? That there are these immutable laws of, we would say today, physics, right? But that was really what was key for Jefferson. The deists had the idea. Jefferson, let me digress a little bit here on Jefferson. And I'm certainly no expert on Jefferson, but I think he's such a fascinating figure that, and it's really relevant to what we're talking about here. Jefferson was, both in his day and later on, even down to today, vilified by some. Vilified meaning thought of as a villain, right? By some, because of his views in this regard. Jefferson was clearly a deist, but there's also good reason to believe, historians have good reason to believe, that Jefferson had some serious reservations about the deity of Christ. Okay? He embraced the morality of Christianity, as all deists did. He thought it, provided a moral code for people to behave themselves. But the question about, is Christ God become man? That Jefferson had some real reservations about that. Did you know, for example, this always shocks students when I tell them this, that Jefferson essentially rewrote what the Christians call the New Testament. Okay? Where he literally took a knife, like maybe something like an X-Acto knife like we would have today, and he went in and cut out any passages from those scriptures that made reference to the deity of Christ or the miracles of Christ. You can look it up on your internet. I'm not making it up. Look, Google the Jefferson Bible. That's what it's called, the Jefferson Bible. And so, as I say, in his day, he had his critics. There's some cartoons of Jefferson depicting Jefferson as the devil with horns and pitchfork and so on. And certainly today, he has his critics. Did you know, for example, the Texas Board of, what's the board that, what's it called that, I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on the name of the board, that decides on curriculum content for public elementary and secondary schools? I forgot what it's called. They voted a couple of years ago to remove from the high school curriculum any references to Jefferson and deism. Okay? I guess they didn't want, Texas high school students to be exposed to such dangerous ideas. Okay? Well, this is a college course, okay? So we don't mind that. We still go ahead and talk about the deism of Thomas Jefferson. Okay? Deism is sometimes, the metaphor that is sometimes suggested, it's not my metaphor. I didn't make this up, but I don't know who to give credit to. Okay, so just some commonly used metaphor. The deist philosophers had sort of this notion of God and creation that they sometimes refer to as the clockmaker model. Okay? So God's like the clockmaker. The clockmaker builds this elaborate machinery, all these gears and levers and stuff, and then when he's done, taps the pendulum and sets it into motion, and it just keeps time. Right? The pendulum just goes back and forth. The clockmaker doesn't have to keep putting his finger in there in the works and tapping the pendulum so it'll keep time. That's what the deists sort of had this view of God. That when God created the universe, he created this elaborate machinery which is governed by these laws of nature, these immutable laws of nature. And he tapped the pendulum and set it into motion. If that tap of the pendulum was the Big Bang or whatever, set creation into motion, but then steps away from it and allows it to run its course. God's not constantly interfering, according to the deists. God is not constantly interfering with the creation, and particularly the affairs of man. And that's this last part here. In the 18th century, denying the interference of God with the laws of nature. That stands in direct contrast to the Catholicism of the pre-Enlightenment period, of the earlier period, which taught that, divine intervention. So this is a very important development during the Age of Enlightenment. Yes, sir.
So, example. So, if deism, they believe that God doesn't interfere in what's happening. Examples for storm watch, it's not God-given situation.
Deist thinkers would, a student in another class asked me a question. I'm going to answer your question, but as prelude, I want to share this with you. A student in another class, when I told them about Jefferson, as I just told you about Jefferson, he asked me, why did Jefferson think such things? Which kind of, tipped me off that maybe he had some very well-formed ideas. And they said, well, why would Jefferson think such things? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not an expert on Jefferson, but I think it's because Jefferson thought it was contrary to reason. Right? Again, that's the whole point about deism, right? Based on human reason rather than divine revelation. So with that in mind, I think there are people today who have a view that...
I have a question.
Yeah, hold on a second. Let me answer Jen's question.
Yeah.
Have a view of God and God's role that is inconsistent with deist thought. Okay? If people believe that God is directing storms or steering storms to this place or not to this place or whatever, I think Jefferson would find that contrary to reason. Does that help?
Oh.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you think Jefferson, in terms of what you just said, like why he believed what he believed, could have been, I don't know, he seemed not to have lived the most moral lifestyle in terms of his choices and what he did. Do you think all that also kind of fell into some of his beliefs in just man and creation?
Well, I'm not sure exactly.
Because I mean,
what
he also
you're
surrounded
referring to
himself
in
with a
terms
bunch
of
of other
his own
deists
life.
also.
What?
He also, I mean, he was surrounded by other people that believed the same thing he did.
Right.
It wasn't just him.
Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, that was it.
Well, I mean, we don't need to get into any specifics. It seems to me like maybe you have some specific things in mind that you would characterize as being immoral in terms of Jefferson's behavior. I don't think we really need to hash those out. We sort of get the general point that you're making. I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer to that question that you have. I don't have a definitive answer for you except to say that many people, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, William Fagan, whoever it is, all human beings, we oftentimes find ways to rationalize the things that we do that might seem to others to be immoral. So I don't know if that really is a very satisfactory answer, but that's the best I can get. Best general answer I can give you is that I think Jefferson was a human being just like the rest of us, and he probably engaged in immoral behavior, at least from time to time. Who among us doesn't, right? Oh well. I mean, maybe we like to have these ideas of our founders as, they should have been above reproach. But I don't think any of them were above reproach. They were, after all, human beings. Okay, good questions, though. Anything else? Actually, very good questions. I'm glad you guys are starting to ask more questions. I think that really serves our purpose better if you guys ask more questions rather than fewer questions. Deism has lots of other ramifications as well. I mean, we could probably develop an entire 16-week course just talking about this topic, but we'll just have to leave it at that and move on. Let me just add one more thing. I think one of the implications of deism, certainly, and we see this clearly with Jefferson, for example, is that in this country we have some very definitive views about separation of church and state. This notion of separation of church and state is really a very Jeffersonian idea. Jefferson was very adamant. Jefferson was essentially the author of the Declaration of Declaration of Rights and Religious Freedom for Virginia, and he was an outspoken advocate of the right of free worship. But as part of this commitment to the right of free worship, he believed that people ought to be able. Jefferson believed that people ought to be able to practice whatever religious faith they believe in. Jefferson once wrote, for example, that it does whether my let's try to get this quote correct. Whether my neighbor says there are no gods or 20 gods does me no harm. It neither breaks my leg or picks my pocket. Right? And that's kind of a very libertarian notion that Jefferson had about the right of free worship. But he believed, very importantly, he believed that the right of free worship, your right to freely exercise your religious faith, is really meaningless unless there is a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson emphatically, in fact, that term, wall of separation, we attribute to Thomas Jefferson, that there ought to be a wall of separation between church and state. Now, others during his period, contemporaries of Jefferson, were not as adamant about separation of church and state. Some were, some weren't. Madison was pretty Jeffersonian, but others, it's just like people today, right? Some people today are advocates of a strict wall of separation of church and state, and others believe that, well, there's some inevitable overlap between church and state, and that's okay for many people. But what I'm telling you is that Jefferson's view, I think, is a direct result of his deist mentality, of his deist orientation. All right, let's move on. Next, we have capitalism's emergence as accepted economic doctrinaire. We were hinting at this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the colonists rejecting British interference with their commerce, beginning in 1763. Right? Part of that is based on their belief that, government's role should be very, very limited in economic affairs, commerce, and as many of you probably appreciate, that's a very basic component of capitalism, a very fundamental premise of capitalism. Okay? Interestingly enough, we can put a year on this one, a specific year, on capitalism's emergence as accepted economic doctrinaire. It is the year 1776. However, it's not the American Revolution or the Declaration of Independence that we look to here as the origins of capitalist economic theory. It's just so happens that it's also the same year as the Americans declare their independence that the Scotsman Adam Smith writes his comprehensive treatise on economy called The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith's treatise, The Wealth of Nations, is viewed by economists and historians today as really being the origins of capitalist economic theory. I don't think it's purely coincidence at all that the Americans declare their independence in the same year that Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations. I think it's because these two things are happening at a period of history where these ideas are bouncing around and they're very prevalent. Well, what does capitalism represent a challenge to? Again, I think it helps if we understand what each of these represents a challenge to. Well, it represents a challenge to the economic systems that Europeans were accustomed to living under in those days. That we use the term mercantilism to denote those economic systems. So let's give you a definition of mercantilism. Mercantilism refers to the economic systems developing during the rise of the European nation states. As the Middle Ages come to an end, and you have the collapse of feudal arrangements, manorial systems, you have the emergence of the European nation states, Portugal and Spain initially, and then France and Britain and Holland. And this is the period where the Spanish and the Portuguese, the French, the British, the Dutch are all getting on sailing ships and sailing off to the Americas and then to Africa and Asia and colonizing and conquering the indigenous peoples. Okay? Why did this? Let's pick on the Spanish for a moment here. Don't worry, I'll put it back up. Okay? Why did the Spanish come to the Americas? Why did they send their explorers to the Americas? What were they hoping to find?
Gold.
They were
Gold,
hoping to find
silver,
you.
minerals.
The conference is about to end.
When they found it,
They bring it back.
they take it back to Spain, load it in the king's vault. Why?
Because they care only about themselves.
Well, so that Spain will be the most powerful nation in Europe, or on the face of the earth. All right? So that whole period of colonization and conquest, the strict government regulation of the entire economy to secure a favorable balance of trade, the development of agricultural and manufacturing sectors, and the establishment of foreign trading monopolies. Remember learning about the British and the Dutch establishing these trading monopolies, the British East India Company, right? And others, right? What's the purpose of all of that? About empire building. Okay? We call that mercantilism. Now, Adam Smith comes along in 1776 and essentially says all of this colonization and conquest, all of this government regulation of the agricultural and manufacturing sectors, all of these foreign trading monopolies, all of this sort of stuff, that's not how you build the wealth of nations. Here's how you build the wealth of nations. Hold on to your chairs. This is going to shock you. Okay? Here's how you build the wealth of nations. You allow people to be free to pursue their own rational self-interests, that they are the best judge of their own self-interests. Allow them the freedom to to take entrepreneurial risks. And when they're successful, the wealth of nations is created as a sum total of all the individual wealth. That's part and parcel of capitalist economic theory. Notice how closely related it is to everything that we've said previously about liberalism. Capitalism is essentially economic liberalism. They make exactly the same kind of assumptions about human nature, society, and government. Okay? So, we're out of time. We will take no more than 5 minutes at the beginning of the class period on Friday to talk about republicanism, and then we're going to move on to a discussion of the Constitution. Okay? We'll see you on Friday.